$3,000 perfume and desperation clung to the women they brought him. They were draped in silk, their laughter rehearsed, and their smiles hollow. Declan Knox, who owned the city's docks, judges, and skyline, sent them all away, drowning in the agony of absolute boredom. Then, on a random Tuesday, the noise finally faded. Down the corridor of the West Wing drifted a voice, raw, unpolished, and heavy with the kind of grief that could neither be bought nor faked, and for the first time in 10 years, the boss stopped walking. The ice in Declan's glass had melted 20 minutes ago. He didn't drink it. He just held the lowball, letting the condensation numb his fingers while he stared down at the ballroom floor. It was his 35th birthday. The syndicate had decided this was a milestone that required a spectacle. So, the Knox estate, a sprawling limestone monstrosity perched on a cliff overlooking the grey waters of the Atlantic, was currently packed with 500 people who would gladly slit his throat if they thought they could get away with it. Instead, they drank his champagne, and they brought him women. "She's a Romanov on her mother's side," Arthur said, leaning against the mahogany railing of the mezzanine. Arthur was Declan's second-in-command, a pragmatist who treated human beings like chess pieces. Educated in Switzerland, speaks 4 languages. She's 24, Declan, and she hasn't taken her eyes off this balcony since she walked in. Declan looked down. The woman in question was standing near the ice sculpture. She wore a backless crimson dress that left nothing to the imagination. Her posture was impeccable. When she caught Declan looking, she offered a slow, deliberate smile, tilting her chin down to look up at him through thick, dark lashes. It was a calculated maneuver, a practiced seduction. Declan felt absolutely nothing. "Tell her to go home, Arthur." Arthur sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Are you out of your mind? This is the 4th one tonight. First the shipping magnate's daughter, then the Italian model. Now a literal aristocrat. What are you looking for, exactly? A saint? A martyr? They don't exist in our tax bracket." "I'm looking for someone who isn't a transaction," Declan said. His voice was low, a gravelly baritone that had earned him the absolute obedience of the most violent men on the East Coast. He set the watered-down whiskey on a passing waiter's tray. "I look at her, and I see a ledger. She wants the protection of the Knox name. Her father wants our supply lines. It's business. If I wanted to make a deal, I'd sit in a boardroom. I wouldn't have to share a bed with the contract." "You're a mob boss, Declan," Arthur reminded him dryly. "Everything is a transaction. You think normal people fall in love? They trade security for youth. They trade money for affection. You're just cutting out the middleman." "Maybe." Declan unbuttoned his suit jacket. The room was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of expensive floral perfumes, roasted duck, and cigar smoke. It smelled like greed. He hated it. He had spent the last decade building an empire out of blood and concrete. He had taken his father's crumbling organization and turned it into an untouchable fortress. He had money. He had power. But the higher he climbed, the more the world flattened out. Every conversation was a chess match. Every smile was a lie. He was surrounded by the most beautiful women money could buy, and they all looked exactly the same to him. Mannequins in designer clothes. "I'm going to my office," Declan said, turning away from the railing. "The party is for you," Arthur warned. "The 5 families are downstairs. You leave now, it's an insult." "Tell them I have a headache." "Declan," I said, "tell them I have a headache." The steel in his voice snapped into place. It wasn't a request. Arthur held his hands up in surrender. "Fine. But I'm not breaking the news to the Romanov girl. That dress looks expensive, and I don't want her throwing a drink on me." Declan didn't smile. He just walked away, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runners lining the upstairs hallway. He wanted quiet. He wanted the sharp, unpretentious burn of cheap whiskey. He wanted to be anywhere but here. 3 floors down, in the dimly lit service corridors of the estate, Clary Davies was on her hands and knees. The music from the ballroom was a muffled, rhythmic thud vibrating through the floorboards. Clary didn't care about the party. She only cared about the smudge of scuff marks on the baseboard near the laundry chute. She sprayed another blast of industrial cleaner, the sharp, chemical smell of bleach and synthetic lemon burning her nostrils, and scrubbed until her knuckles ached. Clary was 26, though the dark circles under her eyes made her look older. She wore an oversized grey polo shirt with the estate's cleaning company logo stitched on the breast, faded black cargo pants, and rubber-soled shoes that squeaked against the linoleum. Her brown hair was yanked back into a messy knot, secured by a plastic claw clip that was missing 3 teeth. She paused, sitting back on her heels to wipe the sweat from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. She glanced at the cheap digital watch on her wrist. 11:45 p.m. 15 more minutes, and she could clock out. Then, a 40-minute bus ride back to her cramped apartment in the Narrows. 4 hours of sleep. And then her second job at the diner started at 6 in the morning. It was a punishing existence. It ground her down, day by day, scraping the marrow out of her bones. But she didn't have a choice. Her brother Tommy was an idiot. A sweet, well-meaning idiot who thought he could beat the underground tables run by the Knox Syndicate. He had borrowed $20,000 from a loan shark affiliated with the family. In 6 months, the interest had ballooned the debt to $50,000. They had broken Tommy's arm 2 months ago. The next time, they promised, they would break his spine. So Clary had gone to them. She hadn't begged. She hadn't cried. She had walked into the dimly lit back room of a butcher shop in Little Italy, slammed her meagre savings on the table, and offered to work off the rest. The men had laughed at her. But money was money. They got her a job with the contractor who serviced Declan Knox's private properties. Every paycheck she earned went straight back to the men who signed it. She kept just enough for rent and ramen noodles. "Hey, Clary." Clary looked up. Maria, a woman in her 50s who worked the kitchen detail, was leaning against the doorframe holding a garbage bag. "You're still scrubbing?" Maria asked, shaking her head. "Leave it. The boss never comes down here anyway. The man lives in the clouds." "If I leave it, the supervisor docks my hours," Clary said, her voice raspy from inhaling cleaning fumes. She leaned forward and attacked a stubborn black scuff mark with her brush. "I can't afford docked hours, Maria. You work too hard for people who don't even know you exist," Maria sighed. "I saw the women upstairs tonight, covered in diamonds. You think any of them know what bleach smells like?" "I don't care what they know," Clary muttered, finally lifting the scuff mark. "I just care about paying off my ledger." Maria gave her a sympathetic look. "I brought you a couple of dinner rolls from the catering trays. I wrapped them in a napkin. They're on your cart." Clary stopped scrubbing. The knot of permanent tension in her chest loosened just a fraction. "Thank you. Truly." "Eat something. You're wasting away," Maria scolded gently, before turning to haul the garbage bag toward the service elevator. Clary stood up slowly, her knees popping. She stripped off the yellow rubber gloves, wincing at the sight of her red, chapped hands. Her skin was perpetually dry, the cuticles frayed and bleeding. She wasn't beautiful. She didn't have the time or the money to be beautiful. Survival took up all her energy. She walked over to her grey plastic janitorial cart. Sitting next to a bottle of glass cleaner was a white linen napkin. She unfolded it, to reveal 2 soft buttered rolls. Her stomach let out a hollow, painful growl. She hadn't eaten since noon. Clary leaned against the cold concrete wall of the corridor. The music from above shifted to something slower, a heavy bass line that rattled the pipes above her head. She took a bite of the roll. It was cold, but it tasted like heaven. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over her. She was a ghost in this house. She cleaned up the messes left by gods, completely invisible to them. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was safe. If Declan Knox or his men actually looked at her, really saw her, it meant trouble. She finished the food, tied her garbage bag, and grabbed the handle of her cart. The night was almost over. She just needed to finish wiping down the mirrors in the East Wing guest bathrooms, a section of the house currently closed off for minor renovations. Pushing the cart over the threshold, she left the noisy, bustling service corridor behind. The East Wing was dead silent. The heavy oak doors and thick walls swallowed the sounds of the party entirely. It was just her, the squeak of her shoes, and the smell of fresh paint. Declan didn't make it to his office. He had taken a wrong turn on purpose. He wanted to put as much square footage between himself and the thumping bass of the ballroom as possible. He wandered into the East Wing. It was quiet here. The air was cool, smelling faintly of sawdust and plaster from the renovations Arthur had commissioned last month. The floors were stripped bare, the antique rugs rolled up and pushed against the walls. He walked slowly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He felt old. Older than 35. He felt like a machine that had been left running for too long without oil. "What are you looking for?" Arthur had asked. Declan didn't know. Peace, maybe. A single moment of authenticity in a life built entirely on bullshit. He remembered being a kid, sitting on the fire escape of his father's cramped brick apartment, listening to the city. People fighting, laughing, living. It was dirty, but it was real. Now, he lived in a castle, and everything felt like plastic. He stopped near a grand bay window. The moonlight spilled across the bare floorboards, casting long, sharp shadows. He leaned against the glass, looking out at the black ocean. Then, he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was faint, muffled by a heavy wooden door down the hall. A voice. Declan frowned. The wing was supposed to be empty. His hand instinctively drifted toward the inside of his jacket, brushing the cold steel of the Sig Sauer holstered at his ribs. Old habits died hard. He pushed himself off the window and moved silently down the corridor, his leather shoes making no sound against the bare wood. As he got closer, the sound resolved itself. It wasn't someone talking. It was someone singing. It wasn't operatic. It wasn't the polished, auto-tuned perfection he heard from the hired entertainment downstairs. The voice was low, slightly raspy, like it had been dragged over rough stones. It wavered on the higher notes, fragile and aching. Declan stopped outside the half-open door of the master guest suite. The song was an old folk tune. A depressing, melancholy melody about miners in the dirt, about burying the dead and waiting for a train that was never coming. It was the kind of song a mother hummed to a child when the heat was shut off and there was nothing to eat, and the cold wind blows through the hollows of the bone. The voice cracked on the word bone. It wasn't a vocal run. It was a physical break, heavy with an emotion so deep and profound it made the hair on the back of Declan's neck stand up. It sounded like exhaustion. It sounded like pure, unadulterated heartbreak. He nudged the door open just a fraction more and looked inside. The grand bathroom was vast, lined with white marble and gold fixtures. At the far end, standing in front of a massive vanity mirror, was a woman. She wasn't wearing silk. She wasn't wearing diamonds. She was swallowed in a baggy grey polo shirt and cargo pants. Her hair was a messy nest, clipped haphazardly to the back of her head. She had a spray bottle in one hand and a blue microfiber rag in the other. She was wiping down the mirror in slow, rhythmic circles. No silver in the pocket. No meat on the stone. She kept singing, completely unaware of her audience. She paused to spray the glass again. In the reflection of the mirror, Declan could see her face. She was pale, devoid of makeup. Her lips were slightly chapped. There were dark, heavy bruises of fatigue beneath her eyes. She wasn't classically beautiful. She was too sharp, too worn down. But as she sang the next line, she closed her eyes, letting her head drop forward just an inch. The sorrow in her voice filled the cavernous, tiled room. It bounced off the marble, wrapping around Declan's chest and squeezing tight. It was the most beautiful, devastating thing he had ever heard. He couldn't look away. For a man who had spent the evening rejecting flawless, manicured perfection, this tired girl with bleach-stained hands was suddenly the center of gravity. There was no pretense here, no calculated smile. She was completely unguarded, pouring a lifetime of weariness into a dusty old song while she cleaned a mirror that belonged to a man she likely despised. Declan realized he was holding his breath. He slowly let it out, the fabric of his suit rustling against the doorframe. The sound was microscopic, but in the echoing acoustics of the bathroom, it was like a gunshot. The singing stopped instantly. Clary's eyes snapped open. The vulnerability vanished, replaced immediately by the hardened, wide-eyed panic of a cornered animal. She spun around, clutching the spray bottle to her chest like a shield. She saw a man standing in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a custom black suit that cost more than she made in 3 years. His face was all sharp angles, a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, a straight nose, and eyes so dark they looked like polished onyx. He didn't look like a guest who had wandered off. He looked like the man who owned the house. Clary's stomach dropped to her shoes. Her voice cracked, dry and small. I'm sorry. I thought the wing was empty. Declan didn't say anything. He stepped fully into the room. The sheer physical presence of him seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. He looked at her hands, taking in the red, raw knuckles. He looked at the baggy shirt that hid her frame. He looked at her eyes, wide with genuine, unfeigned terror. Don't apologize, he said softly. Clary took a step back until her spine hit the marble counter of the vanity. She dropped her gaze to the floor, staring at his polished Italian leather shoes. I'm just finishing the mirrors. I'll be out of your way in 2 minutes, sir. She wanted to be invisible. Declan could see it in the way she hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. What were you singing? He asked. Clary swallowed hard. Nothing. Just noise. I'm sorry to disturb you. Look at me. It wasn't a yell. It was a calm, level command. The kind of command a man issues when he has never been told no in his entire life. Clary's chin trembled slightly, but she lifted her head. She met his gaze. There was no awe in her eyes, no calculation, just fear, and beneath that, a deep, smouldering exhaustion. What's your name? Declan asked. Clary. Clary, he repeated. The name tasted strange in his mouth, grounded, real. Who do you work for, Clary? Sterling, she started, then caught herself. She wasn't supposed to use the subcontractor's name. The cleaning service, sir. I'm just part of the night crew. Declan took another step forward. The distance between them was closing. Clary gripped the edge of the counter behind her. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. He thought of the Romanov heiress downstairs, with her perfect smile and her father's shipping contracts. He thought of the Italian model and the $3,000 perfume. He thought of all the fake, hollow beauty in the world. And then he looked at the girl with the bleach-stained hands and the voice that had just cracked his ribcage wide open. "You're not on the night crew anymore, Clary," Declan said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Panic flared in her eyes. "Please, sir, I need this job. I wasn't slacking off, I was just—" "You're not fired," Declan interrupted, his gaze never leaving her face. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering for a second before he gently plucked the spray bottle from her tight grip. He set it down on the marble counter. "Then what am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Declan looked down at her. "Mine." Arthur dropped a manila folder onto the center of Declan's mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, dismissive thwack. It was 8 a.m., the morning after the party. The estate was a graveyard of half-empty champagne flutes and crushed canapes. The catering crews were quietly hauling out the wreckage. Declan hadn't slept. He sat in his leather chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlantic, watching the grey waves batter the seawall. "Her name is Clary Davies," Arthur said, his voice clipped and irritated. He was nursing a hangover and deeply resented being asked to run a background check on the hired help at 6 in the morning. 26 years old, no criminal record, no college degree. She works for the commercial cleaning company that handles our properties, and she pulls a second shift at a diner in the Narrows. "She's a nobody, Declan. A ghost." Declan turned his chair around slowly. He didn't look at Arthur. He picked up the folder, opened it, and stared at the miserable bureaucratic summary of a human life. "Why does a ghost work 80 hours a week?" Declan asked, his voice rough. "Because she's digging her way out of a grave she didn't dig," Arthur replied, leaning over the desk to tap a specific line on the printed report. "She has a younger brother, Thomas. Goes by Tommy. The kid has a gambling problem and the impulse control of a fruit fly. 8 months ago, he sat down at one of our underground tables in Little Italy. Lost 20 grand. Couldn't pay." Declan's jaw tightened. "Who holds the paper?" "Russo. Frankie Russo was a mid-level loan shark who kicked up a percentage to the Knox family. He was a brute who lacked finesse, but made up for it with enthusiasm. The debt is currently sitting at 52,000, Arthur continued, crossing his arms. Russo broke the kid's arm 2 months ago as a warning. The sister stepped in. She handed over 5 grand in cash, probably everything she had to her name, and agreed to take on the remainder of the debt. Russo got her the cleaning gig through our front companies, so he could garnish her wages directly. Every dime she makes over basic rent goes into Russo's pocket, and by extension, into yours." Declan closed the folder. The sound was quiet, but it hung in the air of the large office. He thought about the girl in the bathroom, the baggy shirt, the raw, bleeding cuticles, the way she had looked at his shoes, making herself as small as possible, terrified that losing her job meant her brother would end up in a landfill. She was breaking her own back to feed the machine that Declan had built. He was the monster at the top of the pyramid, getting richer off the pennies squeezed from a terrified girl scrubbing his floors. The irony tasted like ash in his mouth. "Call Russo," Declan said softly. Arthur hesitated. "Declan, we don't interfere with the street-level collections. It undermines the bosses. You start forgiving debts because a girl caught your eye. The entire structure looks weak." "I didn't say I was forgiving the debt," Declan said, his dark eyes finally lifting to meet Arthur's. The absolute lack of warmth in that gaze made the hair on Arthur's arm stand up. "I said, call Russo, have him here in 20 minutes, and bring me his ledger." 20 minutes later, Frankie Russo walked into the office. He was a thick, sweaty man wearing a suit that was too tight across the shoulders and smelled strongly of cheap cologne and stale smoke. He smiled a nervous, oily smile, holding his leather-bound ledger against his chest. "Mr. Knox, an honor, boss. Happy belated birthday," Russo said, hovering near the door until Declan gestured for him to approach. Declan remained seated. "Put the book on the desk, Frankie," Russo obliged, sliding the ledger across the polished wood. "Turn to the Davies account," Declan ordered. Russo flipped through the pages, his thick fingers leaving faint grease smudges on the paper. He stopped on a page filled with neat, red ink columns. "Ah, Tommy Davies. The kid's a bum, boss. But the sister, she's a worker. Pays like clockwork. Never misses a week." "The original debt was 20,000, Declan stated, reading the numbers upside down. "With juice, it's 52, Russo grinned. "We're making a killing on the interest. It's a good earner." Declan stood up. He moved with a terrifying grace for a man his size. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from Russo. The loan shark was forced to tilt his head back to look at his boss. The oily smile began to falter. "She works in my house, Frankie," Declan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She scrubs the floors I walk on. She cleans the mirrors I look in." Russo blinked, sweat beading on his forehead. I know, boss. That was the arrangement. Keep her close. Keep the money flowing. And you thought it was acceptable to have someone who hates us, someone who owes us her brother's blood, wandering around my private residence with access to my food, my rooms, and my family?" Declan's voice remained perfectly level. It was the calmness of a hanging judge. "She wouldn't do nothing," Russo stammered, taking a half step back. "She's terrified. She ain't got the spine to make a move. You put a liability in my home to line your own pockets." Declan reached out and picked up the heavy brass letter opener from his desk. He didn't raise it. He just weighed it in his palm. "You endangered the head of this family for $50,000 of street money. Declan, please, I swear to God, I didn't think—" "I know you didn't." Declan tossed the letter opener back onto the desk with a sharp clatter. He looked at Arthur, who was standing quietly by the door. "Pay Frankie his original 20,000 out of the main vault. The interest is void." Russo's face went red, but he didn't dare argue. "Yes, boss. Thank you, boss." "And Frankie," Declan added, leaning down to rip the Davies page entirely out of the ledger. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his breast pocket. "If you or any of your men ever go within 5 miles of Tommy Davies or his sister again, I will have Arthur bolt you inside an oil drum and drop you off the pier. Are we clear?" "Crystal, boss," Russo choked out. "Get out." When the door clicked shut, Declan walked over to the wet bar and poured a glass of water. He drank it slowly, washing away the metallic taste of adrenaline. "She's currently downstairs in the service quarters," Arthur said quietly, waiting for her shift supervisor to assign her morning duties. "What do you want me to do with her?" "Go down there," Declan said. "Tell her the debt is gone, and bring her to the east wing." Clary sat on the edge of the mattress. It was an antique 4-poster bed, draped in Egyptian cotton and heavy silk duvets. The room was larger than her entire apartment. The walls were painted a soft, muted sage, and the bay windows offered an uninterrupted view of the sprawling estate gardens and the ocean beyond. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. She had been sitting exactly like this for 3 hours. She was still wearing her grey cleaning polo and her cargo pants. Her supervisor had yelled at her when Arthur walked into the basement. But the moment Arthur spoke her name, the supervisor had turned pale and vanished. Arthur had brought her here. He had handed her a folded piece of ledger paper. "Your brother is clear," he had said. "You are clear." She didn't believe it. Men like Declan Knox didn't erase $50,000 debts out of charity. Everything had a price. The fact that her debt was suddenly gone meant she was about to pay for it with something much worse than her wages. The heavy oak door unlatched with a quiet click. Clary flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress so tightly her raw knuckles turned white. Declan stepped into the room. He had changed out of his formal suit from the night before and was wearing a dark charcoal sweater and black trousers. He looked less like a mob boss and more like a wealthy, tired architect. But Clary wasn't fooled. She had seen the way his men looked at him. She knew what he was. He closed the door behind him and stopped. He didn't advance toward the bed. He just stood near the threshold, watching her. "You haven't moved," he observed. "Where am I supposed to go?" Clary asked, her voice cracking. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her chin steady. "You own the doors. You own the people outside the doors." "You can go home," Declan said. It was a simple statement, delivered without a hint of sarcasm. Clary stared at him. "Home, to my apartment, if that's what you want." He walked slowly toward the small sitting area near the window and sat down in a leather armchair. He crossed his legs, resting his hands on his knees. "The debt is settled. Russo won't touch your brother again. You're a free woman, Clary." She felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat, but she choked it down. "People like me are never free around people like you. What do you want? Just say it. Don't play games with me. Do you want me to sleep with you? Is that the trade?" Declan didn't flinch at the bluntness. He just looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the heavy exhaustion lines on her face, the tense, defensive posture of her shoulders. "I don't buy women," he said quietly. "And I don't force them." "Then what am I doing in this room?" "I wanted to pull you out of the basement." Declan looked away, his gaze drifting out the window toward the grey water. "I saw you last night. I heard you. You were the only real thing in a house full of plastic. I didn't like the idea of you going back to scrubbing floors to pay off a mistake my own people engineered. So, I fixed it." "You fixed it." Clary repeated the words, tasting the absurdity of them. "You think you're a savior? You run the tables my brother played at. Your men broke his arm. You built the machine that was crushing me. You don't get to play God just because you decided to turn the machine off for one day." She waited for the backhand. She waited for the anger. "You didn't speak to a syndicate boss like that. You didn't accuse them." Declan slowly turned his head back to her. There was no anger in his eyes. There was only a quiet, heavy acknowledgement. "You're right," he said. Clary blinked, thrown off balance. "I am? I built the machine," Declan agreed, his voice dropping in register, vibrating with a dark certainty. "I broke your brother's arm. I put the bleach in your hands. I own all of it. I'm a violent man, Clary. I won't lie to you about what I am." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "But I am telling you, right now, that you are safe here. You can walk out that door, go back to the diner, and never see me again. Or you can stay here." "Why would I stay here?" "Because you're tired," he said gently. The words hit her like a physical blow. The absolute truth of it pierced straight through her defensive armor. She was so unbelievably tired. She was tired of the bus rides, the smell of grease, the constant, suffocating panic of the math in her head. Rent, food, debt, interest. "If I stay," Clary whispered, her voice trembling, "what is my job?" "Nothing. That's not how the world works." "It's how my world works," Declan replied. "Eat, sleep, walk in the gardens, let your hands heal." He paused, his eyes dropping to her raw, bleeding cuticles. "Sing if you want to." Clary shook her head quickly. "No, I only sing when I'm miserable." The corner of Declan's mouth twitched upward in a ghost of a smile. "Then my goal is to never hear you sing again." He stood up. The meeting was over. He walked back toward the door, pausing with his hand on the brass knob. "There are fresh clothes in the closet," he said, without looking back. "If you need anything, pick up the phone on the nightstand. Press 0. Arthur will get it for you." "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question pulled from her before she could stop it. Declan looked over his shoulder. The harsh lines of his face softened just a fraction. "Because for 10 years, I've been drowning in this life. Last night, for 3 minutes, you made it stop." He opened the door and walked out, leaving Clary alone in the silence of the massive, beautiful cage. 3 days passed. Clary did not leave the East Wing. She couldn't bring herself to walk out the front doors and go back to the grinding poverty of the Narrows, but she also couldn't accept the reality of the estate. She felt like an imposter, a rat that had somehow been locked inside a jewelry box. She slept for 14 hours the first night. When she woke up, her bones ached with the kind of deep, residual pain that comes from years of carrying too much weight. The clothes in the closet weren't silk lingerie or designer gowns. They were soft, expensive basics. Cashmere sweaters, high-quality cotton t-shirts, tailored jeans and flat leather shoes. It was another calculated move by Declan. He wasn't dressing her like a trophy. He was dressing her for comfort. It confused her more than anything else. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the silence of the bedroom was driving her insane. She was a woman who had never stopped moving. Stillness felt like a trap. She left her room. The hallways were wide and empty. She navigated the labyrinth of the estate, guided by the faint sounds of clattering pots and the smell of roasting garlic. She wanted to find the kitchens. She wanted to find Maria. She needed to see a normal face, someone who understood the language of actual work. She pushed through the heavy swinging doors of the main culinary wing. The kitchen was a massive industrial space, gleaming with stainless steel and buzzing with a dozen cooks and prep workers. Clary stood near the doorway, feeling intensely out of place in her soft cream sweater and clean jeans. "Clary." Maria looked up from a cutting board, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes went wide. "Holy Mother, look at you." Maria hurried over, grabbing Clary by the shoulders and inspecting her like a prized painting. "You look rested. You look like a different person. The rumors are flying, kid. They say the boss moved you upstairs." "I don't know what I'm doing, Maria," Clary admitted, her voice low. "I feel like I'm losing my mind up there. Can I help? Give me a knife. Let me chop onions. Please." Maria laughed softly, patting her cheek. "You don't chop onions anymore, honey. You're under the boss's wing now. If the chef catches you working, we both get fired." Before Clary could argue, the heavy double doors on the far side of the kitchen swung open. 3 men walked in. They weren't chefs. They wore leather jackets and dark slacks, moving with the heavy, arrogant swagger of street soldiers. Clary recognized one of them instantly. Benny. He was one of Rousseau's collectors. He was the one who had held Tommy down, while Rousseau broke his arm with a baseball bat. Clary's blood ran cold. She instinctively took a step back, trying to hide behind Maria's bulk. Benny walked over to the prep counter, grabbing a slice of prosciutto off a tray and shoving it into his mouth. The chef glared at him but said nothing. "You didn't complain when the syndicate's muscle decided to graze in your kitchen." Benny chewed loudly, scanning the room. His eyes locked onto Clary. He stopped chewing. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He wiped the grease from his mouth with the back of his hand and sauntered over. "Well, well, well," Benny drawled, stopping a few feet away. He looked Clary up and down, taking in the expensive clothes, the clean hair, the healed hands. "Look who moved up in the world, the little scrub brush." Maria stepped in front of Clary. "Leave her alone, Benny. She ain't got nothing to do with you," Benny snorted, pushing Maria aside with a lazy shove. "Shut up, old woman." He looked back at Clary, leaning in close. He smelled like stale beer and cheap tobacco. "I got to admit, Clary, when you came to the shop crying over your brother, I didn't see the potential. But look at you now, decked out in cashmere. Must be nice." Clary kept her eyes locked on his chest. She wouldn't look at his face. "My brother's debt is paid." "Yo, we heard," Benny sneered. "Russo was pissed, lost a good earner. But I guess you figured out a better way to pay off the boss, huh? Didn't realize Knox was into charity cases. What did you do? Get on your knees and polish his—" "Benny!" The word wasn't shouted. It cut through the clatter of the kitchen like a razor blade. It was spoken at a normal volume, but the effect was instantaneous. The chopping stopped. The sizzling pans seemed to quiet down. The entire room froze. Clary looked past Benny. Declan was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a dark suit, his tie loosened, his eyes fixed entirely on Benny. He didn't look tired today. He looked like the apex predator of the eastern seaboard. Benny swallowed hard, the arrogant swagger evaporating instantly. He turned around, his hands coming up in a defensive, placating gesture. "Boss, Mr. Knox, we came down to grab some food, just making a joke with the girl." Declan walked forward. The cooks scrambled out of his way, pressing themselves against the stainless steel counters to give him a wide berth. He stopped in front of Benny. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely hollowed out, a man operating on pure lethal instinct. "What was the joke, Benny?" Declan asked softly. Benny was sweating now. "Nothing, boss. Just a misunderstanding. I know she's off limits. Russo told us. I was just busting her chops. No disrespect meant." "You touched Maria," Declan said, his gaze flicking briefly to the older woman who was trembling slightly. "And you insulted my guest in my house." "I didn't." Declan moved so fast, Clary couldn't track the motion. There was a sickening crunch. Benny's head snapped back as Declan's fist connected with his jaw. The street soldier collapsed backward, crashing into a prep table, sending a tray of chopped tomatoes clattering to the floor. Before Benny could even register the pain, Declan was on him. He grabbed Benny by the collar of his leather jacket, hauling him halfway off the floor, and slammed his back against the edge of the steel counter. "Look at her," Declan ordered, his voice a guttural snarl that shook the room. Benny, bleeding heavily from his mouth, his eyes wide with sheer terror, looked wildly at Clary. "That woman," Declan said, tightening his grip until the fabric of Benny's jacket began to tear, "is untouchable. You do not look at her. You do not speak to her. If you breathe the same air as her, you ask for her permission. If I ever hear that you or anyone in Russo's crew so much as looked at her shadow again, I will cut off your hands and feed them to the dogs. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Benny choked out, spitting blood onto the pristine white tiles. "Yes, boss. Swear to God." Declan let go. Benny slumped to the floor, gasping for air. Declan pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his knuckles. He didn't look at the other two thugs standing frozen by the door. "Drag him out of my house." The men scrambled forward, grabbing Benny by the arms and hauling him out of the kitchen as fast as they could. The heavy door swung shut behind them. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Nobody moved. Declan finished wiping his hands. He tossed the ruined handkerchief into a nearby trash bin. He turned around and looked at Clary. The violence was over, but the air around him still crackled with it. He was the monster again. The man who broke bones and ruined lives. He waited for her to run. He expected her to shrink away in horror. Clary stood perfectly still. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but it wasn't from fear of him. It was a strange, overwhelming realization. For 26 years, the world had beaten her down. The world had taken from her, threatened her, and crushed her. For the first time in her entire life, someone had stood in front of her. She took a slow breath, stepping around the spilled tomatoes. She walked up to Declan. She reached out, her small, healing hands gently grasping his wrist. She turned his hand over. His knuckles were bruised, the skin slightly split from the impact. She looked up into his dark, guarded eyes. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. Declan stared down at her, the tension slowly draining out of his shoulders. "I'm fine." "Come upstairs," Clary said, her voice steady. "I'll clean it for you." The master bathroom in Declan's private quarters was not made of white marble and gold like the guest suites. It was dark slate and gunmetal. It looked less like a place of cleansing and more like a bunker. Clary sat him down on the edge of the large, clawfoot tub. She didn't ask for permission to open his cabinets. She rummaged through the drawers until she found a first aid kit, a bottle of iodine, and a stack of clean gauze. Declan watched her. He rested his forearms on his knees, his hands hanging loose. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving behind the cold, familiar hollow in his chest. He was used to women who flinched when the mask slipped. He was used to the fear. Clary wasn't trembling. She pulled up a small teakwood stool, sitting directly in front of him, and took his right hand in hers. "It's going to sting," she said flatly. "I've had worse." She uncapped the iodine. She poured a generous amount onto a cotton pad and pressed it directly into the split skin across his knuckles. Declan didn't wince. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his eyes never left her face. "You shouldn't have done that," Clary said, her voice quiet as she worked. She wiped away the dried blood with methodical, precise strokes. "Benny is an idiot. You didn't need to break his jaw for running his mouth. He put his hands on Maria," Declan said. "And he disrespected you." "I'm used to disrespect. It's the currency of the Narrows." Clary tossed the ruined cotton pad into the trash and picked up a roll of gauze. "Now you've humiliated one of Russo's guys in front of the kitchen staff. That gets back to the street. It makes you look erratic." Declan let out a short, rough breath that might have been a laugh. "You're giving me syndicate management advice now? I'm telling you that you don't need to play the White Knight for me." She began wrapping the gauze around his hand, pulling it tight to secure the dressing. Her fingers were nimble, calloused from years of hard labor. They felt rough against his skin. He preferred it to the soft, manicured hands he was used to. It felt real. "I'm not a white knight, Clary. I'm the furthest thing from it." "I know." She tied off the bandage and finally looked up at him. The proximity between them was suddenly suffocating. Their knees were nearly touching. "You're a criminal. You hurt people for a living. I grew up around men who hit walls and broke bones when they didn't get their way. I know the shape of violence." "Then why aren't you running?" Clary looked down at his wrapped hand. She traced the edge of the white gauze with her thumb. "Because the men I knew used their violence to make me small, to take things from me. You used yours to build a wall around me." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking in the quiet room. "It's a terrifying thing, Declan. Realizing that the most dangerous man in the city is the only person who has ever made me feel safe." Declan reached out with his left, uninjured hand. He didn't grab her. He just lightly hooked a knuckle under her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. His eyes were entirely black in the low light of the bathroom. "I will never lay a hand on you in anger," he said, the words carrying the heavy, binding weight of a blood oath. "I will never make you small. You have my word." Clary searched his face. She was looking for the lie. She had spent 26 years looking for the trap in every offer, the hidden razor blade inside the apple. There wasn't one. He was entirely stripped bare. "Okay," she whispered. He dropped his hand. The space between them cooled instantly. "I need to go to the Narrows," Clary said, shifting the subject abruptly. She stood up, picking up the iodine bottle to put it away. Declan frowned. "Why?" "Because Tommy's debt is clear. But Tommy doesn't know how to survive without a crisis. If I don't check on him, he's going to do something stupid to fill the vacuum. I need to tell him it's over. I need to see it with my own eyes." "I'll send Arthur." "No." Clary closed the cabinet door with a sharp click. She turned back to face him, her spine straight. "He's my brother. He's my mess. I'm not hiding in a glass tower while someone else cleans up my life." Declan stood up. He towered over her, but he made sure to keep his shoulders relaxed, leaving space between them. "Fine, but you aren't taking the bus. I'm driving you." Clary opened her mouth to argue, but the look on his face stopped her. It wasn't a negotiation. "Just you," Clary compromised. "No trailing cars. No bodyguards in suits scaring half the neighborhood. Just you and me. Deal." The Narrows smelled like wet asphalt, fried onions, and decay. Declan drove a matte black SUV with tinted, ballistic-grade glass. He parked it on a cracked sidewalk next to an overflowing dumpster. The contrast between the heavy, armored vehicle and the crumbling brick tenements of the neighborhood was jarring. People on the street stopped to stare. A group of teenagers sitting on the hood of a rusted Honda Civic immediately went quiet, their eyes tracking the SUV with wary, predatory interest. Clary unbuckled her seatbelt. She wore her old grey cargo pants and a plain black hoodie. She had refused to wear the cashmere back to her old neighborhood. It felt like an insult to the people who were still drowning here. "Stay in the car," she told Declan. Declan cut the engine, but didn't make a move to unbuckle. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the dilapidated building in front of them. The front door was missing entirely. The intercom panel had been smashed with a hammer. 10 minutes, Declan said. "If you aren't out in 10, I'm coming up, and I won't knock." Clary nodded. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the humid evening air. She walked into the building, navigating the dark stairwell purely by memory. The third step on the second flight was rotted through. The hallway on the fourth floor smelled sharply of cat urine and stale beer. This was where she had lived her entire life. 2 days away in a mansion on a cliff, and it suddenly felt entirely alien. She knocked on apartment 4B. There was a shuffling sound inside. A voice cursed. The deadbolt slid back with a metallic scrape, and the door cracked open. Tommy stood in the doorway. He was 22, but he looked 40. He was painfully thin, his skin a sallow, unhealthy yellow. His right arm was encased in a filthy fiberglass, cast held up by a frayed sling. He squinted at Clary, his eyes bloodshot and dilated. "Clary." He blinked, opening the door wider. "Where the hell have you been? You haven't been at the diner. The landlord came by looking for the rent yesterday. I had to hide out on the fire escape." He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask why she had disappeared for 3 days. His first instinct was the inconvenience her absence had caused him. A cold, dead feeling settled in the pit of Clary's stomach. "Can I come in, Tommy?" He stepped aside, grumbling. Clary walked into the apartment. It was a disaster. Take-out boxes were piled on the small laminate counter. The television was playing a muted infomercial, the blue light flickering over a coffee table covered in ash and empty beer bottles. "Russo's guys haven't been around," Tommy said, dropping onto the sunken couch. He scratched at his cast with a plastic fork. "Word on the street is some heavy hitter bought out the paper. You know anything about that? Because if the debt got transferred, I need to know who to dodge." Clary stood in the center of the room. She looked at her brother, really looked at him. She saw the weak slope of his shoulders, the shifty, restless movement of his eyes. "The debt is gone, Tommy." Tommy stopped scratching. He looked up, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. "Gone? Like wiped? Are you serious?" He let out a bark of laughter, slapping his good knee. "Holy shit, I told you, Clary. I told you my luck was going to turn. The universe balances out." "Your luck didn't turn," Clary said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I paid it." Tommy frowned, the smile slipping. "With what?" "You don't have 50 grand. He looked at her closely, his eyes narrowing. He took in her clean hair, the subtle shift in her posture. "Wait. You got a guy. That's it, right? You found some rich suit to bail us out." He laughed again, shaking his head. "Damn, Clary, I didn't think you had it in you. Who is it? One of the contractors from your cleaning gig? Hey, whatever works. You sleep with whoever you got to sleep with, as long as the heat is off me." The words hung in the stale air of the apartment. Clary didn't scream. She didn't cry. The exhaustion that had bone-deep residency in her soul suddenly evaporated, replaced by an absolute, diamond-hard clarity. She had sacrificed her life for him. She had bleached her hands raw. She had subjected herself to the terror of violent men in dark rooms, offering up her own future to buy back his. And he thought she had whored herself out. And worse, he didn't care, as long as it benefited him. "I didn't sleep with anyone," Clary said quietly. "Sure, whatever you say." Tommy waved a hand dismissively. "Look, did this guy give you any cash? Because I got a tip on a game out in Queens tonight. And if I just have a little seed money—" "I'm leaving, Tommy." Tommy froze. "What?" "I came to tell you that the debt is clear. You're free. Russo won't come back. But I'm not paying the rent anymore. I'm not buying the groceries. I'm not bailing you out of the next hole you dig for yourself." Tommy stood up, his face flushing dark red. The whining victim instantly transformed into an angry, cornered animal. "Are you kidding me? You're going to ditch me? After everything, I'm your brother, Clary. And I kept you alive, at the cost of myself." Clary took a step back toward the door. "But I'm done setting myself on fire, just so you can complain about the smoke. You're on your own, you selfish bitch," Tommy spat, stepping toward her, raising his good hand. "You find a sugar daddy, and suddenly you're too good for your own blood. You owe me." The door behind Clary swung wide open. It hit the drywall with a massive, structural crack that shook the entire apartment. Tommy stopped dead in his tracks. Declan stepped over the threshold. He didn't look at Tommy. He didn't even acknowledge the younger man's existence. He looked only at Clary. "It's been 12 minutes, Declan said. His voice was calm, but the sheer physical mass of him, the dark, lethal gravity he carried, sucked all the air out of the cramped room. Tommy stumbled backward, his face draining of blood. He recognized Declan. Anyone who lived in the Narrows and played the underground tables knew exactly who Declan Knox was. "Mr. Knox," Tommy stammered, his knees literally shaking. I didn't know. Clary didn't tell me." Declan slowly turned his head. His dark eyes locked onto Tommy. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Declan didn't make a threat. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Tommy with the detached, clinical indifference of a man stepping on an insect. Tommy shrunk into himself, physically backing up until his shoulders hit the wall. Declan looked back at Clary. "Are you finished here?" Clary looked at her brother one last time. There was no pity left, just an empty space where her guilt used to live. "Yes," she said. "I'm finished." She walked out the door. Declan followed her, pausing just long enough to pull the shattered door closed behind them. The drive back to the estate was silent. Clary stared out the passenger window, watching the neon lights of the city blur and bleed into the dark, empty stretches of the coastal highway. She didn't cry. She felt incredibly light, as if a 50-pound lead vest had finally been unbuckled from her chest. She had expected the severing of her ties to hurt. Instead, it felt like breathing pure oxygen for the first time. Declan drove with one hand draped casually over the steering wheel. He didn't press her for details. He didn't offer platitudes about family or loyalty. He understood the necessary brutality of cutting off dead weight better than anyone. When they pulled through the wrought iron gates of the estate, the massive house loomed against the night sky, its windows dark except for the soft security lighting. It wasn't a prison anymore. It was a fortress. They walked inside. Arthur was waiting in the grand foyer, holding a clipboard. "Declan, the shipment from the port cleared customs. We need to sign off on the warehouse transfers." Arthur stopped, looking at Clary, then back to his boss. "Handle it," Declan said, walking right past him without breaking stride. "I need your signature on the routing numbers," Arthur protested, following them toward the staircase. "Forge it," Declan shot back, "and clear the west wing. Tell the security detail to do their perimeter checks from the outside. I don't want anyone inside the house." Arthur stopped at the bottom of the stairs, sighing heavily. "Right. Forging signatures, clearing the house, normal business operations. Got it." Declan led Clary up the stairs. They bypassed the guest wing entirely. He walked her straight into his private quarters. The suite was massive, dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a heavy oak desk, and a wall of windows facing the ocean. A fire was burning low in the stone hearth, casting flickering orange shadows across the dark leather furniture. Declan walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He walked back and handed one to Clary. She took it, wrapping her hands around the heavy cut glass. "To dead weight," Declan said, raising his glass slightly. Clary met his eyes. "To dead weight," she echoed. She took a sip. The whiskey burned like liquid fire sliding down her throat, but it settled warm in her stomach. She walked over to the windows, looking out at the black expanse of the ocean. The waves were crashing against the rocks far below, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards. "You don't owe me anything," Declan said quietly from behind her. "The debt is gone. Tommy is cut off. You're completely unanchored. If you want a ticket to California, I'll buy it tonight. If you want an apartment in the city, I'll sign the lease." Clary turned around. Declan was standing near the fire. He had taken his jacket off, the holster of his gun stark and black against his white dress shirt. He looked tired again. He was offering her the world, fully expecting her to take it and run. "I don't want a ticket," Clary said. "Clary, I spent my entire life cleaning up messes," she interrupted, taking a step toward him. "I scrubbed floors. I paid debts. I took care of a brother who would have sold me for a poker chip. I don't know who I am without a job to do. You don't have a job here, I know." She closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. The heat from the fire warmed her back, but the heat radiating from him was stronger. That's why I want to stay. Because when I'm here, I don't have to be useful to be visible." Declan looked down at her. The cynical, hardened armor that protected him from the world was completely useless against her. She didn't try to pierce it. She just walked right through it. He set his whiskey glass down on the mantelpiece. He reached out, his large hands gently gripping her waist. He pulled her against him. Clary rested her cheek against the center of his chest. She could hear his heartbeat. It was slow, steady, the rhythmic thumping of a machine that had finally found its anchor. She wrapped her arms around his torso, resting her hands flat against his back. They fit together perfectly. Two jagged, cynical pieces of the world that had somehow found a smooth edge in each other. "Sing for me," Declan murmured, resting his chin on the top of her head. Clary closed her eyes. She thought of the song she had sung in the bathroom days ago. The sad, heavy melody of miners and cold bones. That song belonged to a girl who was drowning in bleach and debt. She took a slow breath. She didn't sing a folk song. She sang a jazz standard, a slow, smoky tune about midnight train rides and rain on a tin roof. Her voice was still rough, still unpolished, but the heavy, crushing sorrow was gone. It was replaced by something else. Something warm. Declan closed his eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm of her voice, holding her tight against him as the fire burned down to embers in the dark. The city outside continued to grind its teeth, full of hollow beauty and violent men. But inside the glass tower, the noise had finally stopped. Sometimes, the most powerful man in the room isn't looking for a queen to rule his empire. He's looking for the one person who makes the empire feel real. Declan and Clary proved that survival isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about finding the one place where you're finally allowed to rest. If you loved the journey of the Mafia boss and the girl with the bleach-stained hands, make sure to hit that like button. Share this story with a friend who loves a dark romance with real emotional depth. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another dramatic original. Drop a comment below. Would you have walked away or stayed in the glass tower?